I'd like to introduce our next two panelists here. One is Frank Bernardino. Frank's an old friend. I still recall at 2:30 in the morning you helping me with my first set of talk points for my first committee appearance, so thank you for that. But Frank's a partner at Anfield Consulting. He's built a successful consulting company specializing in water resources and environmental policy. Next to him, we have Rob McLean from the Southwest Water Company. Rob is their president and chief executive officer and has over 20 years expertise in the water industry. And I saw we did have a question after that last panel. We're going to try to build in enough time for you to have those. But if you would take a minute, if you do have questions, to please fill out the questionnaire forms. They're on each of your tables. And you can turn that in to either Spratt or Brewster or Jeff, and we'll grab those and we'll kind of have a consolidated manner in dealing with those. And please take it away, Frank.
Good afternoon, everybody. I was really excited when Jeff reached out to me this year and told me that one of the things, it's always been a priority of AIF under the leadership of Speaker Feeney, but this year we want to advance and amplify the message of dealing with the investment that the state is or is not making on water infrastructure and the challenge that local governments around the state face in the area of infrastructure. And let's see if we can get this to go. Oops, no, went too far. Back up. There we go. I think everybody in the room, if you're a practitioner in this area, understand the need that we have across the nation, in particular in Florida, and how important it is for us to take this issue head on. I was thrilled when Jeff told me that we were going to have Rob join us this year, because Rob is a practitioner in the nation. He's from Texas, and he sees other parts of the country in that challenge. And I thought it was fascinating to be able to contrast and compare what we're doing versus things that are occurring in other parts of the country. So Rob, we're thrilled to have you here, and why don't you share a little bit with us about the work that you're doing and stuff that's going on around the country.
Sure, Frank. Well, as Frank said, I work for Southwest Water. We're in 6 states. We serve about 500,000 customers. And Florida's not one of the states I'm in, so we will be, today I'll be talking about kind of national level stuff. I'll be Charlie Munger. Frank is going to be Warren Buffett. He's going to be talking about Florida very specifically. This slide, you hear this a lot. Just the volume of water lost in the United States is a pretty impressive amount. And the funding gap is also pretty impressive. We'll have some slides that come up later, but the looking that I've been able to do is there's about a 3x gap between what folks say the necessary funding is compared to what the funding availability is. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then, of course, main breaks, that's when what is invisible underground usually becomes visible, and customers want action. It was great to be kind of preceded by that panel that came before me, because I think all utilities in this country are facing very similar things to what you heard from the prior panel. Perfluorinated compounds, lead and copper compliance, continually increasing, more difficult standards. I'd add to what I heard from the prior panel things like an aging workforce. In some states, we've got booming economy that's driving our water workers to the oil patch or other jobs where they can make a better living, pensions and things like that. Let's go to the next slide,
Sure.
Frank, if we could.
This is actually the original presentation, so we're going to have to go work off of that. I apologize for that. All right.
Yeah, we had some other really cool slides. I don't know if we can get BD in here to switch it back, but so Frank, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure.
And, we'll go
So from the Florida perspective, some of you have seen some of these numbers. We bring this information forward on an annual basis in order to again, bring some context to this conversation. You can see each of the sources for each of the estimates is documented in the slide. And the take-home message is that Florida has roughly a $53.81 and growing billion-dollar challenge over the next 20 years. It's significant to note that figure, which if you were here last year was under $50 billion, so the gap is only increasing, does not include anything related to sea level rise. So when Broward County and Kevin, who was here previously, talks to you about the challenges that their utility face, they've already identified that there's a number of coastal well field systems that are going to have to be eliminated and replaced as a result of the fact that we have rising sea levels. So What are we doing about it? Well, our ability to do anything and make any significant impact in this sector is directly proportional to the amount of funding that is available for us to get that work done. Again, these are updated slides and include the information from these years, from the budgets of the water management districts. And what we see in this slide is that from the high in 2007 of ad valorem revenues, which is a primary source of funding for the water management districts, after we suffered the recession of between 08 and 09, you saw a 21% reduction in that. And then you saw the legislature respond. The legislature said, you know what, our communities are going through a difficult time. We need additional tax breaks. So they instituted policies which resulted in a further reduction of 31% of the ad valorem revenues, tax relief for the citizens. Combined is approximately half of the revenues from that one source that the water management districts lost over a very short period of time. And since then, we have had a policy in place which prevents the water management districts from increasing their revenues. They're required, if they were to keep the revenues that resulted from a specific tax rate, they would have to advertise that as a tax increase. And that's something that politically right now, no one, or for some time now, no one has wanted to tackle. So you see that their revenues have pretty much flatlined. Here's a different, seen a different way, when you combine all of their revenues, not just ad valorem revenues, but state funding that the legislature gives them directly, plus some federal sources, you see that they collectively lost about $1 billion worth of funding for all their water programs in a 5-year period. That's a dramatic reduction. I mean, if you stop to think about as an industry what we could do with $1 billion more revenue. There has been some increase and some recovery of that, and if you recall the prior slide, it's not as a byproduct that their revenues have increased from their ad valorem collections, but rather that the legislature has been put in a position to have to backfill. So these new programs that we've had in recent years that the legislature has prioritized, like the Blue Lagoon Algae Program, the Springs Program, the Red Tide Program, all of these things are being now supplemented with additional state revenues. So we're turning towards the legislature as the source from which future revenues are going to come if we don't modify the policy that the districts are operating under. When you look collectively at all of the dollars that then the legislature has allocated for water infrastructure, you see that last year was an amazing year, right? So this past year, the governor announced his bold new policies, launched a lot of new programs, and the legislature actually appropriated more than what he asked for, and we eclipsed for the first time ever $700 million in state spending. But when you look at that figure for context, here we have where the money is going. Everglades, the green line, is always the winner. The Everglades gets more funding than any other program. The next two are actually not grant programs, they're loan programs. They're the drinking water revolving loan and the wastewater revolving loan programs. So that's money that has to be repaid by local governments. Then you get the Springs program, the purple line, and lower down agricultural BMPs and total maximum daily loads. So that's where the state dollars are presently going. But as a percentage of the state budget, how much are we investing? And those of you who've heard me give this speech before, always remember that the state has averaged over the last 15 years less than 0.5% of the state budget. It is what goes comprehensively to all things water infrastructure. And when I say all things water infrastructure, I mean all things water infrastructure. This includes all of the programs that you saw before, as well as member water projects, individual line items that get added. Recently, I saw in Shortell in the back of the room, the Keystone Heights area of the St. Johns River Water Management District, appropriately so, has gotten some significant funding support. And so what does that say about how we value water as a society, that such a small percentage of the budget actually goes to that? Here's another interesting statistic. So the state budget during that window that I showed you has expanded by approximately $25.5 billion. But water as a sector in the budget has only managed to capture 1% of that revenue. So where do we stand with regard to other areas of infrastructure? And you've seen this graph before, so I'll put it up again. Nothing has changed. The transportation sector, for example, the infrastructure for roads and bridges, captures about 11% of the state budget. Again, this year, no difference. They got $9.8 billion, which, by the way, did not include member water projects in the transportation arena, which are above and beyond that. So it's remarkable to think that in a state where water is such a critical commodity, where it's such a precious resource, that the disparity in priorities, if our state budget is a reflection of our values, we need to ask ourselves the question, does it actually reflect the values? And what is it that we can do about that? Now, Rob, I know that in Texas, in recent years, they've taken this issue head on. As a matter of fact, I remember seeing this quote during a very important year in 2013 when Texas really embraced this issue and said, we're going to do something about it. And I found it very ironic that the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Texas says, well, you know, I don't want to lose our businesses to Florida because we don't have water. I guess he hadn't taken a look at our percentage of spending on state water when he made that statement. But anyway, give us a little bit of information about what's going on in Texas.
Well, sure. This is a perfect example of not letting a good crisis go to waste. And if you guys remember that in Texas in 12-13, they had historic drought. That was followed by historic wet weather. But in November of 13, there was a ballot measure on the up for a vote to take $2 billion out of the state's rainy day fund and transfer it over to the Texas Water Development Board. And then, they kind of leverage that, and that's the $25 billion that you see there. That ballot measure passed 73% yes vote. So pretty impressive that at that time, everybody in the state knew, okay, this is a major drought. The other thing that's going on in Texas is, when I look at the state water plan for Texas, they're predicting about a 70% population increase over the next 50 years. So not only are they dealing with, water when they want it and don't want it and falling in different places, they're dealing with this population increase that's much like Florida. I think a lot of growth, and that comes with its constraints and things. I had a couple slides that I wanted to show, and
they're working on putting them up right now.
Working on flipping it over.
Yeah, let's see if we got there.
Are we good?
Okay. Hold on, with your permission or without it, here we go.
All right. So there you see a nice picture of a tuberculated water pipe, which is pretty common. Frank, how do I get this?
This one.
Right there. Okay. And I wanted to touch on this theme because I think it's really important to understand this as you think about financing of water and wastewater in this country. There are about 50,000 community water systems, about 14,000 permitted wastewater systems. When you think about it's a lot. There are only about 3,300 electric utilities in the United States. So one of the challenges that you have being a small utility is, if you have to, let's say, replace a pump or motor or well, and you need $1 million, you might be able to get it, but spreading $1 million over 200 customers or 300 customers can't afford that. And so this is a major challenge in our country, is that there's so many small systems, and they may be well run, but when their time comes for replacement, it's pretty tricky to be able to make that math work from a customer rate impact. You see here, you can't see anything but a graph, but just an interesting anecdote for trivia fans. The one on the far right is Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has only about 6 million people in the state, but they've got 11,000 community water systems. That's pretty crazy. Here you see just a picture of health-based violations around the country. Florida actually looks pretty good in this slide. My home state, Texas, has got about 1,100 violations, which is quite a lot. A very small amount of those are coliform violations. That's the stuff you really want to avoid. Most of those violations are things like disinfection byproducts, arsenic. These are the contaminants that they won't catch up with you overnight, but if you consume water for a lifetime, can really cause ill effects. And so, you see a snapshot of that in different places in the country there. Now, this is a pretty cool slide here too. The orange is So this is funding of water infrastructure in the United States over time. And on the axis, you've got billions of dollars. And so in the blue is the money that comes from the federal government. It's really, when you step back and look at it this way, it's a very, very small amount, less than 5-10% of the funding is coming from federal sources. And the orange is a combination of local funding and state funding. And so I remember back when the stimulus money came out, and some of my colleagues were able to get a few $1 million of money for shovel-ready projects to change water meters and do things like that. I mean, that's the best kind of money. When it comes free, you don't have to pay it back sometimes, or you only have to pay 10% back. But I think that, particularly with what's going on in Washington, I'm not expecting to see the floodgates open and all of that money start pouring in. And so, the challenge here is that you've got these major needs for funding in most utilities in the country. The money is not going to come from federal sources for the most part. It's going to be up to state and local sources. And of course, local means you're raising rates to pay for it. And I wanted to talk about that for a second because a couple years ago, J.D. Power started surveying water utilities in the nation. They started surveying the big ones. And if you Google J.D. Power, you can see the rankings for the Southeast. You'll see where the Florida utilities perform in that assessment. They actually do pretty well. But it's interesting to note that water utilities rank pretty low relative to all the other kinds of things that J.D. Power measures, including even airlines, if you can believe it. So your average water utility has a J.D. Power score lower than your average low-cost airline. And part of why that is, we've been through some studies with J.D. Power in one of my former lives, is that, of course, as a water utility customer, you don't have a choice of who is your provider. And so that concept of choice is kind of a philosophical thing where once you choose, you might even be happy with something that's not the best. But as utilities work to address this infrastructure challenge, there is going to be pressure on things like customer satisfaction at J.D. Power, and customers are going to demand action associated with that. Okay, Frank, back to you on the Florida situation.
And what all of this takes us to is, and I'll just flip to these quickly since you've already seen them, is that at the end of the day, making significant changes in the legislature is about explaining to them, not only from a community standpoint, not only from a health standpoint, not only from a resiliency standpoint, why this should matter to them. The one thing that I find often gets lost and in the narrative with the legislative body is this description about how important it is to our economy. And I thank you for bringing up the stimulus. So, the numbers that you saw before that I showed you actually do include the federal dollars that made their way down to Florida for stimulus. And the reason why they had no impact is because almost all of our stimulus dollars went to transportation. Every time that you have a policymaker stand up historically and talk about providing stimulus funding, they always say, we got to build roads, we got to build bridges. And I always sit there saying, and we got to do water plants and wastewater plants. And they never seem to make that leap. And so is it their fault or is it our fault? Is it the fault that they've heard it, they haven't heard it, and they've ignored it? Or is it the fault that as communicators, as a community of water professionals, and I'm talking to everybody in this room, as a community of environmental professionals, are we doing an adequate job of educating our policymakers as to the significance of this issue? Because I have a hard time believing that if we actually did, that the numbers would be what they are. And so here's an example in this slide of one analysis that's been done about how investment in water infrastructure translates to jobs in your community. And what's wonderful about the water sector, that unlike the transportation sector, This investment is not only going to result in jobs in the design and engineering and construction, but obviously the maintenance. So the slew of environmental professionals and people that and water professionals that benefit from this are not just the high-end jobs, but they're also the practitioners, the operators, the low-end jobs. These are people who remain in the community, continue to provide benefits in the community, and are part of the fabric of that community. And again, it's an important message that we need to get out. So in Florida, here's what we're trying to do about it. A number of us worked on this issue. Actually, Pep Ruccino, who's in the room and soon going to be your director of the Beaches and Shores Association. I know I'm killing that name, but anyway, worked on this piece of legislation. And so what we said is we told the state has an office. The legislature has an office called the Office of Economic Demographics and Research. They are the E.F. Hutton of the legislative process. Their job is to tell the legislature and to project not only the amount of money that they're going to have to spend, but also the changes in different policy areas that they're going to have to address. So for example, they're the ones that tell the legislature, here is the number of people that we project will move into the state this year. Here's how many more seats we're going to need in K through 12 schools. Here's how much money we're going to need for hospital beds. Here's how much additional prison space we're going to need. It might surprise you, or it may not surprise you, those of you who heard me rant on this before won't be surprised, that historically the state of Florida never received an estimate of the amount of money that would be needed to address our water infrastructure needs. And that remains true to this day. We tried to tackle that issue. So what we did is that we asked EDR, the Office of Economic Demographics and Research, to generate this report. You can go to their website and look at it. We're now in the 3rd edition of this report. But what they did is, as opposed to, and they did exactly what we asked them to do, we should have worded it better, as opposed to trying to find out how much money we're going to need, instead they looked at the state budget and said, how much money, what programs are we funding now? How much money do they need now? Given a growth index, how much money are they going to need in the near time future? And then they looked at the revenue from all the sources that the state have, which is not just taxes, but it's fines, fees, grants, and any of a number of other sources that the state has. And how do those two mesh up? So this year's version basically said, we're going to have almost a $400 million budget gap based on our current programs and our current level of service. So again, this is not taking into consideration what you need. It's just like if we want to keep the engine running, this is what we're going to need. And if you look at the information in a little bit more detail, and I apologize, I don't know, it projects very well, but what you see in this graphic, this is the aha moment in the report. You can go to them all. Actually, you can pretty much in the later years skip most of the verbiage and just go to this one slide, because this is the one where the rubber meets the road. And what you see here that's interesting, a couple of things that are highlighted. So they project that starting next year, we're going to have a $102 million deficit, again, to keep the engine running, just to keep the current programs going at the levels that we want them to. And then out for 10 years, we're going to be $383 million in the hole. Now, what they tell you is, but don't worry about that, because if you look at the bottom line, that bottom line is the amount of money that they expect to have available through the Amendment 1 referendum that passed a few years ago, the Water and Land Amendment. So they said there's going to be ample funds available from that source to make up that deficit. Again, this doesn't speak to the $50 billion plus number that I showed you earlier. Now, as you know, the issue of how that money can be spent is currently being litigated, and there's oral arguments that are going to be coming up soon. So we don't even know that the Supreme Court is going to allow this source to be used for that purpose. But regardless, if you look at those red numbers and you add them up across the line, you're billions of dollars in the hole. So how are we going to tackle this challenge? That's an essential question that needs to be addressed. So what we did this past year is we said, okay, we really need to get at the heart of this issue. We really need to know that number. We really need to have that information. So we pulled together a coalition of the groups that you see listed here, and we proposed a bill. And the bill was sponsored by Representative Jacobs, a Democrat, ranking Democrat in the House, Senator Albritton in the Senate. And what that bill proposes to do is to look at how much money we're going to need and to devise a plan for how we're going to get there, how we're going to meet that challenge. Basically, what you want is on a 5-year horizon, a 20-year horizon, a study that looks at all of these areas: water supply, water quality, restoration, wastewater, stormwater, flood control, environmental infrastructure, and tells us how much money we're going to need. The key is the bottom bullet. Don't just tell us how much we need, but tell us, where could the money come from? There are other states and other countries that are doing very innovative things with regard to financing public infrastructure. Are we taking advantage of all of those vehicles? And here's some of the sources that folks around the country are tapping. I know you wanted to go over these.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably most practitioners in the room are familiar with most of these. The big ones are the Clean Water SRF Fund, which is usually administered by your local state agency, and the Drinking Water SRF Fund. That's great money to get. Sometimes you can get it forgiven. Usually always comes with a super low interest, like the last one I had was like under 2%, something like that. And then lately, the last year or two, they've started the WIFIA program, which is really for bigger projects, which I think is minimum 20 or 25 million, something like that. And then on, you've got some other, I guess, more kind of specific funding opportunities. But to my knowledge, this is kind of the listing of what is available on the federal side for drinking water, wastewater funding.
Yeah, and so I think the take-home message that both of us have is clearly this is an area where, to make progress, everybody needs to engage. One of the things that I often find interesting is in the legislative arena, I think that things happen on a generational basis, a legislative generational basis. And what I mean by that is that the legislature has a tendency to tackle an issue. And whether they fix the problem or not, oftentimes they say, okay, been there, done that, we covered it. And so that's all that we're going to do. And you literally need a flip of the members of the House and the Senate before the issue becomes new again and people say, aha, maybe we need to do something more about it. I'm often amazed, we talk with much romanticism about the greatest generation, right? They saved the world from fascism, folks died all over the world, but then more amazingly, they came back to a torn up country that was heavily in debt because of the war, and they built it, they rebuilt it. They built the transportation system and the water infrastructure that now is falling apart, but is the backbone of what has allowed us as a society to prosper and grow. As late as 30 years ago, a bunch of brave people and very foresight-thinking people in Florida said, we need to set up a structure for how we're going to manage our water resources. And that's how we got our water management district. I often joke in the Capitol, if today I brought to you an idea, I've got this great idea. I want to create 5 regional agencies based along hydrologic boundaries, and we're going to use property taxes to fund them. I wonder how far I'd get. Probably not very far. But they had the courage and the foresight to think ahead and do something about it. So now the ball is in our lap. Now it's our time to pick up the football and walk onto the field and see what we can do about it. I believe with every fiber of conviction that I have in my body that if everybody who was in this room, because we've got an amazing array of water professionals and water practitioners in this room. I see engineering firms. I see people with environmental groups. I see government agency representatives. I see state legislators. I see law firms. I'd ask you, what have you done recently to help us tackle this issue? Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to money. I believe with every ounce of conviction that I have, that if the people in this room alone decided that this mattered enough that we were going to do something about it, and this year we weren't going to stand on the sidelines, but we were going to get in the game and help push this message forward, I believe that we could get that bill passed. That bill will create the foundation from which we will then build a program in the future. If next year by this time, we know what our debt is, we know what the challenge is, and we know what all the potential funding sources are, the policymakers are not going to be able to ignore that. there's going to be a call to action. I know that there's several groups already that are thinking one step ahead and actually want to propose bills that would put specific funding sources in place for specific programs this year. But I think that if we took that on as a challenge, we could make it happen. But the question is, do you individually, as a person, are you going to do something about it? At Florida Water Advocates, we're a ragtag group of believers. Nobody's compensated. Ryan Matthews is sitting in the back of the room. I see him standing outside the room. He doesn't like the way I talk. So anyway, he's one of the key people that's with our group. But we have many others that help us get this message out. We're happy to give this information and these slides to any audience that you think could or would want to hear it. And we hope that we can next year talk about the bill that we passed and how we're making progress in this area. Is there anything you want to add? Nope.
I think that's well stated, Frank, yeah.
All right, we're open for questions. We're going to get this conference back on schedule real quick. Questions, anybody? All righty then. I don't see. You're going to have a long break.
We're going to have a break, I guess, huh?
I heard no break, but got to take a quick break. We'll take a quick break and then get right back in here with our next panel with Representative Tom Cow kicking us off. So if y'all take about 10 or 15 minutes and then join us back in, we'll get cranking. Thank you.